What's up, my wizards? It's Dev. From Mtg, we like magic. And no, I'm not going to stop wearing this shirt. I really like this shirt. But anyway, welcome back to the Week of Weird. We've been profiling a bunch of, off-the-wall, oddball lists that I've been working on. And even though these lists maybe aren't Tier 1 or even Tier 2, I think they at least deserve to be talked about, once, because if I don't talk about them, nobody's going to talk about them. That'd be really sad. So I think these are really interesting concepts, at least, that I want to release into the zeitgeist, see what you guys say about them, and then we'll go from there. But even though I downplay the power level of these lists, today's deck might be one of the most powerful that we look at all week. Here's Black-White Paladin of Atonement. When Rivals of Ixalan spoiler season was going down, one of the cards that caught my attention the most at the time was Paladin of Atonement. This thing looks really, really cool, but as the season's gone on, we haven't heard a peep out of the Paladin, and it's easy to understand why. It looks like a good little bit of work to get this thing, really going and to get real value out of it. But I'm here to tell you, it's not as hard as you might think. Well, the magic number with Paladin, as far as I'm concerned, is 3. If we can get it to 3/3, then we paid 2 mana for a 3/3 that when it dies, we get 3 life off of. That's actually pretty good value at a really decent rate, and that much is not hard to attain. All you gotta do is actually cast Paladin with an If Near Deadlands or Chefhead Dunes, and then when you say go, your opponent will untap during their upkeep, it'll get a +1/+1 counter. Then, if they attack you during their attack step and you let some damage through, well, then when you go, you'll have a 3/3 Paladin. So, you didn't have to work too hard to get that much value out of it. And if it gets to 4/4 or 5/5, then it's really out of control the amount of value you're getting for your 2 mana creature. So, and again, not too hard to make that happen at all, especially considering that a lot of the cards that we can build around this card are really good right now, proven. Real facts, for instance, Glintsleeve Siphoner. You gotta play a playset of this, right? It's indisputably one of the best 2-drops in the format already, and it gets even better in a Paladin of Atonement deck, Whenever you draw cards off of it, you're also proccing your Paladin, which is pretty freaking sweet. Not only that, but we also get a Danto Vanguard. This is also proven to be one of the better 2-drops in Standard. Not quite on the same level as Glintsleeve Siphoner, but during its tenure in the meta, it's actually shown up in a lot of different lists. So Danto Vanguard is another card that's proven to be a headache. For a lot of players, especially control players, you can get in a quick 6. This thing can put up 9 on the scoreboard for you against some control decks before it's all said and done. It's a ridiculous card. Already incredibly aggressive, tough to get rid of, and it's even better in this deck. But we're not getting off the gravy train yet, son. We got some biscuit wheels to talk about in the form of Dusk Legion Zealot, which I'll just play a 3 of here. I'm not going to go all the way and play 4, although you certainly could. It's a fine card. It's like an Elvish Visionary, but it pings you, and we turn that into an upside in this deck, It's kind of like an immediate Glintsleeve Siphoner. With Siphoner, it's nice to draw a card, ping yourself, and eventually get a counter on Paladin. Well, this works pretty much the same way, except we don't have to wait until our upkeep and spend energy and stuff drawing the card. We just get it immediately, which feels pretty nice. Now, believe it or not, that is actually the end of the cards with the word creature in their type line, but don't let that fool you. We're not actually done talking about our quote-unquote creatures, including the most important creature in the deck, all 4 copies of Gideon of the Trials. This is maybe the most integral card to our game plan in the entire list. Really second only to Paladin of Atonement as far as important cards in the deck, but that's because we built the entire thing around Paladin of Atonement, which makes Gideon really, really good so that we don't kill ourselves. As long as we have a Gideon emblem out, we won't die to our own damage. Obviously, a lot of this deck is built around us dealing damage to ourselves. Now, we're using all of the best cards in the format that do that, but we still are in danger of occasionally killing ourselves, especially against really fast aggro decks. And Gideon helps keep that from happening. So I'm going to play all 4 copies. He's got a huge target on his back, and they're really gunning for him, so you won't always feel bad about having an extra copy in your hand. And not only that, but he's going to finish the game off for us kind of a lot if Paladin doesn't do the job, or if our dumb trick that I'll show you at the end of the video doesn't do the job. Then Gideon can a lot of the time. Just a 4/4 hard to kill is tough to deal with, We're mostly hoping that Paladin gets to 6/6 or 7/7 before it finally pops and we can get in some damage with it, but just in case, in Wars of Attrition, Gideon's actually pretty good. Keeps us from losing the game, period. That's nice, long as he's out at least. And sometimes he can attack in for the win too. So I'm going to play all 4 copies. We'll do the playset here. But we're also going to pack a couple of copies of Aethersphere Harvester. This just kind of does a lot of stuff. It doesn't tax the mana base in any way. We can play with any color mana. It gives us a little bit of energy, and we can control our life total with that. It's very important in this deck. We're pinging ourselves a lot to get a little bit of life total control, and Aethersphere is pretty good with that. Or we can use the energy for our Ether Hub or to draw cards off a Glint Sleeve, We don't have a whole lot of flying creatures in this deck. As a matter of fact, this is the one. But it's a great flying creature, It blocks Glorybringer and survives, blocks Rekindling Phoenix and survives, and against some boards it can get in some damage. This will be the thing that wins you the game sometimes too. So Aethersphere is just amazing. You got to play at least a couple of copies in this deck. We got plenty of stuff to crew it with too, so don't worry about that. Now, we need to play some removal in this deck, not only because white and black has some of the best removal in the entire format. We get access to some really sweet stuff here, but also because, again, we're killing ourselves in this deck. This is sort of one of the old school, suicide decks. A lot of our cards will deal damage to us, so we have to not die against aggro decks or creatures in general. It's really important that we play removal in this deck. So we'll start off with 4 obvious copies of Fatal Push. Early game, this is great, amazing. You can squeeze it on top of other plays on turn 3 or 4, and it's even fantastic in the late game a lot of the time when you can activate Revolt in a number of ways. So Fatal Push is just an absolute must. All 4 copies of this so we don't die to aggro, which is ostensibly at least our worst matchup. Now, in a similar vein, I'm going to play 2 copies of Moment of Craving and 2 copies of Vraska's Contempt in this deck. Both of these help control our life total, and Moment of Craving is especially awesome in the early game, and Vraska's Contempt helps control some of the harder to deal with things in the format, Hazoret, Scarab God, blah blah. You've heard them all by now, but these are really important cards that we're extremely likely to run up against, and Vraska's Contempt is good against all of them, including Chandra, which is something else we don't really like to see too much. But we're actually not done with the removal here. I'm going to close it out with 2 copies of Settle the Wreckage and 1 copy of Ixalan's Binding. I prefer the Silver Bullet Binding over a 3rd copy of Vraska's Contempt, but that's your call. You can make that call if you want to, and obviously Ixalan's Binding is way better on the budget than Vraska's Contempt. And I do like that, Vraska's Contempt does help control our life total, but it is a little bit harder to cast. But it's instant speed, but Ixalan's Binding locks them out of ever playing a Scarab God, a Hazoret, a Chandra, or whatever, ever again. There are definitely arguments between the 2 cards, but that last argument for Ixalan's Binding is why I'm playing a singleton of it, Being able to essentially get virtual card advantage off of this, if you hit a Hazoret with it, and then they draw any number of Hazorets, you've gotten a form of card advantage off of Ixalan's Binding. I think that's really, really good, and I want to at least run the 1 copy of it. But as far as Settle the Wreckage goes, this is just fantastic against everything. It's a great safeguard against aggro decks, and there are some control decks even that if you play this and you end up hitting Torrential Gearhulk or Scarab God, you've still gotten a lot of work out of it against a deck that it's not even supposed to be good against in the first place. So Settle the Wreckage is just fantastic, whether you're taking out 1 or 2 big guys or even a whole field full of smaller dudes. But there actually are a couple of slots yet to be filled in this deck, and I'm going to spend one of those main deck slots on a copy of Argel's Bloodfast. I don't want to draw this too often against aggro, so I'm going to put 1 in the main and 1 in the sideboard, but this card is so phenomenal against control that I'm willing to run the risk of drawing it game 1 against more aggressive decks. And it's pretty obvious synergy too. This is great with Paladin of Atonement. We can not only use it to proc Paladin, that's pretty good, but once we flip it over, then we at least threaten to, if they want to target Paladin with removal, for instance, we threaten to, at instant speed, be able to sacrifice Paladin and gain a very real amount of life. If Paladin is like a 5/5 at that point, we can gain straight 10 life off of sacking a Paladin if that's what we need to do at any given time, or if they target it with removal. Like if they hit it with Vraska's Contempt, we can sacrifice it in response and gain 10 life and fizzle their Vraska's Contempt. That's a pretty sweet play too. So it's ridiculous with Paladin, but it has good enough play on its own against control decks that I think it deserves at least the 1 slot. But finally, the absolute dumbest card in the entire deck, and where half of the deck's name comes from, here's a couple of copies of Axis of Mortality. Now, I do think you might be able to get away with 1 or even 0 copies of Axis in this deck and put in a number of other cards. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but the whole point of this week is to jam together weird concepts that are synergistic and see what happens. And in a deck where we're trying, pretty much, to run ourselves out of life, Axis of Mortality is great. For the most part, a big Paladin or Gideon getting through on an empty board will win the game for you, but every now and again, Axis will come down and finish a game off, and that's a really good feeling. Here are the lands right here. We're playing 25 of them, and it's pretty much what you'd expect. We've got to run all 8 of the relevant deserts here. We've got Ifnir Deadlands, Chef at Tunes. Chef at Tunes is actually really good. Sometimes you want to sacrifice it or even another desert to give your whole team of small dudes a little boost. That can be really important, especially if you've succeeded in keeping the other side of the board relatively clean with your removal. Chef at Dunes can lead to Alpha Strike sometimes, and even Ifnir Deadlands is at least passable removal occasionally. So they're good for, just what they do. But again, just like a lot of these cards in this deck, they're even better because they're ultimately like the most reliable ways to get counters on Paladin. Now for this video, I'm going to go over the sideboard slide by slide here and sort of tell you what cards we're using to combat what strategies, because we're splitting our focus between 3 different decks here. But I'll start with Control. We do okay against Control, but they can counter some of our really big plays, so we have to safeguard against that. We're going to do that with Duress and Lost Legacy. We'll do 3 Duress and 1 Lost Legacy, and we'll also have a copy of Argyle's Bloodfast in there for the Control matchup, obviously making them discard counterspells and other key cards. Removal, for instance, if we don't want our Paladin to go away or trying to resolve an Axis, that's where Duress and Lost Legacy can be very good. And obviously Lost Legacy is especially great against Approach of the Second Sun builds, which we see a lot of right now. And I've already talked about how crazy Bloodfast is in this matchup. We'll save another copy in the board. But most of the slots in the board are dedicated to winning the aggro matchup, because obviously that, again, is one of our worst matchups. It's not hard to see why. So we'll start off shoring up that matchup by playing 3rd copies of Settler Wreckage and Aethersphere Harvester, both obviously important cards in those matchups. But we've also got 3 copies of Authority of the Consuls, and even 1 copy of Oketra's Last Mercy. I don't have to tell you why Authority is good. It's just specifically great against the mono-red aggro decks, and it's even great against tokens matchups and decks that have a lot of stuff they bring back, like Scrapheap Scrounger, and even stuff like Dread Wanderer. This card can be at least somewhat good against, mitigate some of the damage they would otherwise do. So Authority is definitely in, no questions asked. But Oketra's Last Mercy is actually just something that I've sort of included because I had some mercy for it. You don't need to run this card in the sideboard. Originally, it was in the main deck. But I just felt like there were way better ways we could use those slots. So I ended up in the sideboard. It can occasionally be a great saving grace against aggro decks, but it's not necessarily on a high enough power level that I want it in the main deck. But we've got some plans against mid-range too, most notably the 2 copies of Dusk Dawn, 1 copy of Vona, Butcher of Magan, and just one, of Never Return. I actually really like Never Return still. I know it's sorcery speed, whatever, but it can take out any non-hexproof, non-indestructible creature in the format. That's an awful lot of them. And it can kill Planeswalkers, something else that can take out a Chandra, which we actually really, really care about. And Return even has, some good things about it. It can take out, high-value Scarab God or Godfarer's Gift targets from the opponent's graveyard. And, creature. That's not always bad either. So I don't mind Never Return as a one-of, specifically against mid-range mostly. Now, to be honest, this 1 copy of Vona in the board here was Profane Procession for a while, and I still think Profane Procession, you can make an argument that it's more effective against mid-range decks than Vona is, and ostensibly that's what we're trying to do with this sideboard slot, is combat mid-range. So if you wanted to go with Profane Procession, that call is on you, but I went with Vona because it's just way more synergistic with what we're trying to do, and it's still a fine card against mid-range. If we can get it to attack block even once, it's great, and its tap ability is ridiculous against mid-range too, for the most part. So it's a little bit more removable. It's not quite as reliable, but just for synergy purposes, I think he's the better call. And finally, Dusk Dawn is actually one of our most important sideboard pieces. It's great against any mid-range deck that you come up against, or Dinosaurs decks, for instance, red-green monsters. Just a great card against a few different lists. And it gives us the ability to bring back literally any of our creatures once we cast Dawn and put them in our hand. Paladin, Glintsleeve, Adanto Vanguard, Dusk Legion, they all come back to our hand when we cast Dawn. So that's just ridiculous. It's great if you're into these long, grindy, mid-range matches. Dusk Dawn is ridiculous. Definitely put both copies in when you run across mid-range. And as I've been doing lately, I'm going to set aside a little section here for some cards that I wanted to play or was playing at one time. For instance, Live Fast. I think Live Fast, actually, there's a lot to say about it in this deck. Drawing cards is great. It's pretty easy to cast. It gives you energy for Glintsleeve, Ether Hub, whatever, So I think Live Fast could have a slot in the deck, but I also argue that Argyle's Bloodfast is just a better card. I also think it might be correct to play some number of Liliana Des Majesty in this deck, even if you only play one copy, but I'd be better off, I think, with 2 copies. And this could be what you play instead of Axis of Mortality. This is also great in grindy games. Sometimes her +1 can win you a game just by putting zombies on the battlefield and you keeping the other side of the board clean. That's good. This can also retrieve Paladins and Vanguards and stuff from your graveyard when you need it to. There's a lot of really cool stuff about Liliana, and I think it could absolutely work in here. There's also Start to Finish, and to another point, the same end, really, Yahini, but I think I like Start to Finish as an idea a little bit better. You know, start giving you a little bit of tokens, you know, a couple of chump blockers, a way to get you deeper into the game. That's not bad, and it's actually a pretty good offensive card against, you know, control decks and other decks that keep their board relatively clean throughout the game. So I don't mind Start, but Finish I am very interested in. You know, being able to take out any creature unconditionally is really good, and it gives us the ability to control a little bit better when Paladin goes to the graveyard. So if we need to gain some life, it seems like a good play. Gain a bunch of life and kill a creature all at one time. So I kind of like that aspect of Finish too, and I think it might be correct to play a copy or 2. And finally, because I know you're going to ask, yes, I tried Blazing Hope in this deck. It looks like the deck for it, but now you see 2 copies of Moment of Craving where it used to be 2 copies of Blazing Hope, you know. Even though it looks like the perfect deck for this card, it still sits dead in your hand for pretty much the entire game until what would be the final turn of the game. It's a sort of a don't lose the game this turn card. That does affect the board, you know, which I think isn't too bad. You know, the card wasn't horrible or anything, but I just think that a lot of our other removal pieces do the job just as well or better. You know, by the time we get to where we can even cast a Blazing Hope, we can cast an Ixalan's Binding, we can cast a Vraska's Contempt, and I would just like to, you know, to play those cards over a Blazing Hope, because 9 times out of 10, when we get to the point in the game where Blazing Hope is relevant, those other cards are just going to be better anyway. And here are your power rankings. A somewhat surprising final score of 66. Not the highest score in the world, obviously, but a very competitive score. The deck actually plays a bunch of really good removal. Some of the stronger 2-drops and a really strong Planeswalker. You know, this deck is no slouch. It does play a couple of weird things. Yeah, I'll give you Paladin, I'll give you Axis of Immortality, but for the most part, this deck is packed to the gills with really powerful stuff in this format. Very good removal suite. We're really versatile because we have a few different plans that we can go on in this deck, and we're fairly resilient. You know, 1 Paladin dying can gain us a bunch of life. There's a couple of other ways we can control our life total in this deck, and you know, once we get Axis down, that's the ultimate in resiliency. So I think this is one of the most powerful decks that we'll cover this whole week while we're looking at weird off-the-wall and seemingly unpowerful decks that would otherwise get no one talking about them. This does, I think, break that mold a little bit. The deck does obviously have some weaknesses, but it can still pull off some games because there's a lot of really powerful stuff in it. But the deck is like $200 right now, and that's mostly the fault of like Fatal Push, Vraska's Contempt, you know, Settle the Wreckage, Gideon, all the lands. There's a bunch of pretty high value stuff in this deck. But again, it can win you some games. You could argue that you could be doing better stuff with black-white in this format. There's a lot of cool black-white lists going around the meta right now, but I don't think that you could have more fun with black-white than you can with this list. This is a really fun list to play, and just because of the sheer number of ridiculous cards in it, if you play the deck right, you will win games. And if you're interested in checking this one out, you can always, as usual, click the very first link down there in the description box. That'll take you over to my sponsors, a TCG player. They help sponsor my content. Good people over there, and they're where you can get this deck for cheap. I know the deck is relatively expensive, but the cheapest place you can get it is over there. So click the link in the description and go check the deck out. And I guess I'm tapped out for this one, but we're only like halfway through our weird week here. We got a couple of more decks I want to look at that are just a little dumb. A little bit dumb, but a lot of fun, and I had a lot of fun brewing them up, and I really want to talk about them. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Hit the bell for the notifications so you get those decks when they come up. Not to mention Dominaria spoilers and Masters 25 spoilers coming down the pipe super soon. You can also like the video if you liked the video. Follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev, or throw me $1 a month of your hard-earned money. I acknowledge you. You've worked very hard for the money. Oh, so hard for it, honey. But if you got an extra $1 a month, throw it my way at patreon.com/SBMTG, and I'll do you a favor. I'll let you know what decks we're doing 24 hours before we do them. So help me out with that if you want to, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. And remember, especially nowadays, you guys, it's very important to remember, spread love and be kind.